They called me a freeloader at that family dinner, laughing like it was some kind of inside joke while my brother basked in congratulations for his latest promotion. The word hung in the air like smoke, choking me with years of dismissed achievements and erased contributions. But the next morning, in a boardroom full of executives, my father's boss stood up, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "Good morning, ma'am," with the kind of respect that comes with seeing a full military uniform and the rank insignia I'd never bothered to mention at home. That's when everything changed. My name is Caroline Mercer, and I should have known better than to come home. The dining room felt smaller than I remembered, suffocating under the weight of forced celebration and my mother's overbearing floral centerpieces. Linda had outdone herself this time. The table groaned under crystal glasses that caught the chandelier light like tiny prisons, each one reflecting a distorted version of the family I'd tried so hard to belong to. The smell of her famous pot roast filled the air, mixed with the cloying sweetness of her vanilla candles, and something else I couldn't quite place. Disappointment. Maybe. I'd driven down from Denver that morning, 3 hours through Colorado mountain passes that should have prepared me for the altitude change I was about to experience. But nothing could have readied me for this. Sitting at the far end of the mahogany table like an afterthought, watching my family celebrate my brother Ethan's latest triumph while treating my presence like an inconvenience they were too polite to address directly. To Ethan, Robert's voice boomed across the table as he raised his wine glass, the burgundy liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. My father had always been dramatic, but success, Ethan's success, brought out the showman in him. Vice President of Strategic Development at Morrison Financial. 34 years old and already climbing mountains the rest of us can only dream about. The chorus of approval rippled around the table. Aunt Margaret clapped her manicured hands together. Uncle Paul nodded with the sage wisdom of someone who'd peaked in middle management decades ago. Cousin Jessica, barely 25 and still living in her parents' basement, looked at Ethan with the kind of adoration usually reserved for movie stars. I lifted my own glass, the motion automatic. Learned. The wine was expensive. Robert never skimped when it came to celebrating his golden child, but it tasted like ash in my mouth. Of course, Robert continued, his voice taking on that particular tone I knew too well, the one that meant he was about to deliver what he considered wisdom. It's nice to have the whole family together, even those of us who are still finding our way. His eyes found mine across the table, and there it was, the look, the one that said I was 36 and still somehow a disappointment, still somehow not living up to the Mercer family standard that Ethan had apparently set in stone. Robert. Linda's voice carried a warning, but it was the kind of warning that was meant to be heard, meant to draw attention to exactly what she was warning against. Caroline works very hard. The way she said it made work sound like a hobby, something I did to keep myself busy between real responsibilities, like knitting or book clubs. Oh, I'm sure she does, Robert nodded, taking another generous sip of wine. It's just, well, when I think about providing for a family someday, about real security, about building something that lasts, he gestured vaguely in Ethan's direction. That takes a certain kind of drive, a certain kind of sacrifice. Ethan had the grace to look uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to speak up. He never did. In 38 years of brotherhood, I could count on one hand the number of times he'd defended me, and I'd still have fingers left over. Some people, Aunt Margaret chimed in, because of course she did, are just more suited to the traditional path. Marriage, children, stability, not everyone needs to conquer the corporate world. The implication hung in the air like a gas leak, dangerous and impossible to ignore. I was the spinster aunt, the cautionary tale, the one who'd chosen career over family and was obviously paying the price for it. Caroline's always been independent, Linda said, and somehow made independence sound like a character flaw. Ever since she was little, always had to do things her own way. Remember when she insisted on building her own treehouse instead of using the one Robert built for the children? Stubborn. Robert agreed, as if I wasn't sitting right there. Sometimes I wonder if we were too permissive, maybe if we'd pushed her toward something more practical. The word hit me like a physical blow, practical, as if everything I'd worked for, everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd achieved was just an elaborate way of avoiding real life. Around the table, the conversation continued to swirl, moving seamlessly from my apparent life failures to Ethan's upcoming projects, his new corner office, his plans for expansion into international markets. Nobody asked what I thought about international markets. Nobody asked what I thought about anything. I sat there, cutting my pot roast into smaller and smaller pieces, watching my family celebrate everything I wasn't while ignoring everything I was. The chandelier light caught my reflection in the china cabinet glass. A woman in a simple black dress, understated jewelry, hair pulled back in a professional bun that Linda had already commented on twice. "You could do something more feminine with it," she'd suggested when I arrived. "Maybe some curls." As if curls would somehow make me more worthy of their attention. The evening stretched on like a slow-motion car accident, each comment a small collision, each laugh at my expense another piece of glass embedded in my chest. By the time Linda brought out Ethan's favorite chocolate cake, decorated with "Congratulations VP Ethan" in blue frosting, I'd stopped tasting the food altogether. They called me a freeloader that night, laughing like it was a joke we were all in on. But tomorrow, I thought, watching them toast to Ethan's future while erasing mine. Tomorrow they'll learn exactly who they've been so eager to dismiss. After dinner, while the family gathered in the living room for Ethan's slideshow presentation, I found myself studying the walls like an archaeologist examining evidence of a lost civilization. My civilization. Apparently. The hallway leading to Robert's study was lined with framed photographs, a carefully curated museum of Mercer family achievements, Ethan's high school graduation, his college diploma, his first job promotion, his wedding to Sarah, who couldn't make it tonight because she was feeling under the weather. More likely, she was smart enough to avoid these family gatherings. I walked slowly along the gallery, searching for any trace of myself. There, a group photo from Ethan's business school graduation. I remembered that day clearly because I'd driven 8 hours to be there, had even bought a new dress for the occasion. In the photo, there was a sliver of navy blue fabric at the edge, cut off so cleanly it looked intentional. My arm. That was all that remained of me in that moment. "Caroline, come look at this," Linda's voice carried from the living room, artificially bright. "Ethan's put together such a wonderful presentation about his journey to VP." I rejoined them as Ethan clicked through slides on his laptop, the images projected onto the white wall where my high school academic achievement awards used to hang. Those had disappeared sometime during my sophomore year of college, replaced by a tasteful landscape painting Linda had found at a craft fair. "This is from the early days," Ethan was saying, his voice warm with nostalgia. "When I first started thinking about entrepreneurship." The slide showed a photo I remembered well, Ethan in his first apartment after college, surrounded by whiteboards covered in diagrams and equations. What the audience couldn't see was that half of those equations were mine. I'd spent weeks helping him work through the mathematical foundations of his initial business concept, sleeping on his couch and surviving on coffee and determination. But in this version of history, I had never been there at all. "God, you were so focused even then," Cousin Jessica sighed. "So driven." The next slide made my breath catch. It was a photo of the prototype I'd spent 6 months developing in my spare time, a security algorithm that would later become the foundation of Ethan's first major contract. But the photo had been cropped. Where I should have been standing next to the computer setup, there was just empty space in the edge of a table. I could see my hand in the corner of the frame, barely visible, wearing the old Casio watch I'd had since college. That watch was the only proof I'd ever existed in that moment. "This prototype changed everything," Ethan continued, clicking to the next slide. "It was the breakthrough that convinced Morrison Financial to take a chance on a 26-year-old with big ideas. Robert beamed with pride. I remember when you showed me that design. Brilliant work, son. Pure genius. The memory hit me like a physical blow. I remembered that conversation differently. Robert had been in Ethan's apartment when I'd finished debugging the final version of the code. I'd walked him through every component, explained the security protocols, demonstrated how it could adapt to different threat levels. Robert had listened intently, asked probing questions, even taken notes. 2 weeks later, he'd presented my work to his golf buddy who happened to be a partner at Morrison Financial, claiming it was Ethan's breakthrough innovation. When the contract came through, worth more than either of us had ever imagined, Ethan had looked at me with something that might have been guilt, but he'd signed the papers anyway. The funny thing is, Ethan was saying now, I almost gave up on it. The coding was so complex, the security protocols so intricate. There were nights I thought I'd bitten off more than I could chew. He wasn't lying. Exactly. He had thought about giving up. That's when he'd called me, desperate and panicked, begging for help. I'd driven down from Denver that same night, spent the next 3 days essentially rebuilding his entire system from scratch. But you stuck with it, Uncle Paul said admiringly. That's what separates the winners from the quitters. Linda nodded sagely. Ethan's always been like that. Even as a child, he never gave up on anything important. The slideshow continued, each image a carefully edited version of events I remembered very differently. Ethan's second major innovation, based on research I'd shared with him from my graduate work. His breakthrough presentation to the board, using slides I'd helped him design during a weekend I'd spent at his house. His promotion to senior developer, after I'd spent months coaching him through technical interviews via video call. In every photo, every story, every moment of triumph, I had been systematically erased. And here's the team that made it all possible, Ethan said, clicking to a group photo from his company's first major celebration. The original Morrison Financial Tech Division. I stared at the screen. I'd been at that party. I'd even helped plan it. Had suggested the venue because I knew the owner. But in this photo, the group was arranged differently than I remembered. The spacing was off, unnatural. Someone had been edited out. Such a tight-knit group, Margaret observed. You can tell they really believed in the vision. They did, Ethan agreed. Everyone gave their all to make it work. Everyone except the person who'd actually written half the code. Apparently. As the presentation wound down to enthusiastic applause, I excused myself to the bathroom and locked the door. In the harsh, fluorescent light, I stared at my reflection and tried to process what I'd just witnessed. It wasn't just that my family had forgotten my contributions. They had actively removed me from their history. I thought about the financial investment I'd made in Ethan's startup, money I'd saved from 3 years of government work. He'd promised to pay me back with interest once the company was profitable. That had been 8 years ago. I thought about the patent applications I'd helped him file, the technical documentation I'd written, the client presentations I'd rehearsed with him until he could deliver them flawlessly. I thought about Christmas mornings when Linda would apologize that my stocking was smaller than Ethan's, explaining that his needs are just more complex right now. About birthday dinners where the conversation inevitably turned to Ethan's latest project. About family photos where I was consistently positioned at the edge, easily cropped out if necessary. They hadn't just erased me from tonight's slideshow. They'd been erasing me for years, methodically and deliberately, turning me into a footnote in my own family's story. But as I splashed cold water on my face and prepared to return to their celebration, I realized something that made me smile for the first time all evening. Tomorrow, they would learn that some people are much harder to erase than others. I returned to the living room just as Ethan was accepting congratulations and handshakes, his face glowing with the kind of satisfaction that comes from being the center of positive attention. Linda was already clearing dessert plates, humming softly to herself. Always the perfect hostess, always making sure everyone felt welcome. Everyone except me, apparently. Caroline, sweetie, could you help me with these dishes? she called from the kitchen, her voice carrying that particular maternal tone that wasn't really a request. I followed her into the kitchen, where she was already rinsing plates with mechanical efficiency. For a moment, we worked in silence, the sound of running water and clinking china filling the space between us. Through the doorway, I could hear Robert regaling Uncle Paul with stories about his boys and their business acumen. "You've been quiet tonight," Linda said finally, not looking at me as she scrubbed at a stubborn spot on one of her good plates. "Everything all right?" Everything all right? As if the evening hadn't been a systematic demolition of my existence, conducted with the casual efficiency of people who'd had years of practice. "Just tired," I said, drying a wine glass with more care than it probably deserved. "Long drive." "You should really think about moving closer to home," she continued, her voice taking on that familiar lecture tone. "Denver's so far away, and with your job, well, I'm sure you could find something similar here, something that would give you more time for family, for the important things." The important things, like being here to watch Ethan's slideshow of stolen achievements. "Actually," I said, setting down the glass and pulling out my phone, "work's been pretty demanding lately." I opened my calendar app, scrolling through tomorrow's schedule. There it was, blocked out in red, strategic planning session, Aegis Systems, 0900-1200. The meeting I'd been preparing for weeks, the one that would determine the next phase of several classified defense contracts worth more than Ethan's entire company's annual revenue. The irony was almost poetic. "Oh, that's nice. Dear," Linda said absently, clearly not listening. "What kind of work was it again? Something with computers." Something with computers. 20 years of specialized education, security clearances that took longer to obtain than most people's marriages lasted, and she thought I did something with computers. "Strategic consulting," I said, which wasn't technically a lie. "Government contracts mostly." "That sounds stable," she said with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for discussing insurance policies. "Steady pay, good benefits. That's important for someone in your situation." My situation? Single, 36, apparently unemployable in any field that mattered to the Mercer family hierarchy. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Marilyn Cole, CEO of Aegis Strategic Systems. We'd worked together on 3 major projects over the past 5 years, and she'd specifically requested me for tomorrow's session. The message thread showed our most recent exchange from this afternoon. "Cole, looking forward to your assessment tomorrow. The Morrison financial proposal has some interesting elements, but something feels off about their technical claims. Me, I'll review everything tonight, have some insights that might be relevant." "Cole, your insights always are. See you at 9. I stared at that exchange for a long moment, feeling something shift inside my chest. Not anger, exactly. Something colder and more deliberate, something that had been building for years and was finally ready to crystallize into action. "Linda," I said, slipping my phone back into my pocket, "what time did you say Ethan's meeting was tomorrow?" 9:30, I think. With some big defense contractor, Aegis something Robert's so proud. Apparently it could be their biggest contract yet. She beamed as she said it. The kind of maternal pride that should have included both her children, but somehow never quite managed to stretch that far. "Aegis Strategic Systems," I said quietly. "Yes, that's it. Do you know them?" I almost laughed. Did I know them? I'd spent the last 3 years developing next-generation security protocols for them. I'd briefed senators on their defense applications. I'd written white papers that had influenced federal policy on cybersecurity infrastructure. "We've worked together," I said. "Oh, how wonderful. Maybe you could put in a good word for Ethan. You know how these things work. It's all about connections." Connections. She thought I was some middle management functionary who might be able to mention Ethan's name to someone who knew someone who might have influence. "I'll see what I can do," I said. After we finished the dishes, I made my excuses about needing to get back to my hotel to prepare for an early morning. The goodbyes were perfunctory, hugs that lasted just long enough to fulfill social obligations, promises to do this again soon that everyone knew were lies, reminders from Linda to take care of yourself, delivered with the kind of concern usually reserved for elderly relatives with concerning symptoms. Robert walked me to my car, his hands shoved deep in his pockets against the October chill. "You know we love you, Caroline," he said as I unlocked my door. "Your mother and we just want to see you settled, happy, secure." "I know, Dad. Ethan's done well for himself. Really well. Sometimes I think—" He paused, looking out at the streetlights reflected in puddles from the afternoon rain. "Sometimes I think maybe we pushed him harder because we knew he could handle it. Maybe we were too easy on you." Too easy on me. As if struggling for recognition in a family that had already decided I wasn't worth the effort was some kind of gift. "Maybe," I said. "It's not too late. You know, to make changes, to find something that really matters." I started the engine, letting it warm up in the cool night air. Through the living room window, I could see Ethan and Linda looking at something on his laptop, probably planning his presentation for tomorrow, planning his triumph. "You're right," I told Robert. "It's not too late." I drove back to my hotel in silence, my mind already shifting into the methodical planning mode that had served me well in briefing rooms and crisis situations. Tomorrow's meeting would require careful preparation. I had documents to review, strategies to consider, and a presentation to refine. By the time I reached my room, I was no longer thinking about tonight's humiliations or years of accumulated slights. I was thinking about tomorrow morning, about a conference room full of executives, and about the look on my family's faces when they realized exactly who they'd been so eager to dismiss. Tomorrow, they would learn that some games have rules they never bothered to understand. And I had been playing by those rules for a very long time. I arrived at Aegis Strategic Systems at 8:45 sharp, dressed in my formal military uniform, the one I'd never mentioned owning, let alone wearing regularly. The navy blue fabric was crisp with fresh pressing, the silver eagle insignia catching the morning light streaming through the lobby's floor-to-ceiling windows. My service ribbons created a neat rainbow of achievement across my chest, each one representing missions and accomplishments my family had never bothered to ask about. The security guard at the main desk straightened immediately when he saw me approaching. "Good morning, Colonel Mercer," he said, his voice carrying the automatic respect that came with recognizing rank and clearance level. "Ms. Cole is expecting you. Conference room A, 23rd floor." "Thank you. Sergeant Martinez," I replied, reading his nameplate and noting the Marine Corps pin on his uniform blazer. Old habits, in my line of work. You learned to notice details, to read people and situations quickly. It was a skill that had served me well in briefing rooms from the Pentagon to Ramstein Air Base. As I crossed the marble lobby toward the elevator bank, I caught sight of two familiar figures near the visitor registration desk. Robert stood with his shoulders squared in his best suit, the charcoal gray one Linda had bought him for Ethan's wedding. Beside him, Ethan paced nervously, checking his phone and adjusting his tie with the kind of restless energy that came from high stakes and higher anxiety. They hadn't seen me yet, too focused on their own preparation for what they clearly considered the most important meeting of Ethan's career. Robert was giving him last-minute advice, his voice low but intense, while Ethan nodded and tried to look confident. "Remember," Robert was saying as I passed within earshot, "these military types appreciate directness. No nonsense. Show them you understand their world." Their world, if only he knew. I pressed the elevator call button and waited, listening to their conversation continue behind me. "The technical presentation should speak for itself," Ethan said, patting his leather briefcase. "The algorithms are solid. The security protocols are cutting edge. Morrison Financial wouldn't have backed this if it wasn't revolutionary." Revolutionary? He was right about that, though not in the way he thought. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the 23rd floor. As the doors began to close, I heard the receptionist call out to Robert and Ethan. "Mr. Mercer, Ms. Cole will see you in about 15 minutes. If you'd like to have a seat, I'll let you know when they're ready." The doors closed before I could see their reactions, but I imagined them settling into the lobby's leather chairs, probably reviewing Ethan's presentation one more time, maybe discussing strategy for handling questions about technical specifications they didn't fully understand. The elevator climbed smoothly, carrying me toward a confrontation that had been building for years. My reflection in the polished steel doors showed a woman they wouldn't recognize, not the dismissed daughter in a simple black dress from last night's dinner, but a uniformed officer with 20 years of classified achievements and the kind of security clearance that opened doors they couldn't even imagine existed. The 23rd floor was all glass and steel, with panoramic views of the city spreading out below. Marilyn Cole's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia who'd been managing executive schedules since before I'd graduated from the Air Force Academy, looked up as I approached. "Colonel Mercer, perfect timing," she said with a warm smile. "Ms. Cole wants to brief you on this morning's interesting presentation before the meeting officially starts. The Morrison Financial Proposal. Among other things," Patricia's expression suggested there was more to discuss, but that wasn't unusual. In the defense contracting world, there were always layers beneath the surface, complications that didn't appear in official documentation. She led me to a smaller conference room adjacent to the main boardroom, where Marilyn Cole was waiting with a stack of documents and an expression that mixed professional courtesy with barely contained irritation. "Caroline," she said, standing to shake my hand. "Thank you for coming in early. We have a situation." Marilyn was in her 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun and the kind of commanding presence that came from 3 decades of managing billion-dollar defense contracts. She'd been CEO of Aegis for 8 years, and in that time had built a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on legendary. "The Morrison Financial team," I asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Their lead presenter is a man named Ethan Mercer." She paused, studying my face. "Any relation?" "My brother." Marilyn's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't comment immediately. In our line of work, family connections were noted but not necessarily discussed. What mattered was competence, clearance, and results. "The technical specifications in their proposal," she continued, "are impressive. Almost too impressive for a company of their size and experience level. Some of the security protocols they're claiming to have developed." She slid a document across the table. "They bear a striking resemblance to work I've seen before." I glanced at the pages, recognizing immediately the algorithms I'd spent months perfecting, the encryption methods I'd developed during my graduate work at MIT, the multi-layered authentication systems that had taken years to refine. They were presented as Morrison Financial's proprietary innovations, backed by patents that listed Ethan as the primary inventor. "Interesting," I said, keeping my voice neutral. What's particularly interesting," Marilyn continued, "is that these protocols are remarkably similar to the security framework you developed for our Phoenix project. The mathematical foundations, the logical architecture, it's almost identical." She was giving me an opening, a chance to explain the discrepancy before the meeting began. In the defense world, intellectual property theft wasn't just unethical, it was potentially criminal, especially when it involved classified methodologies. "I'll need to review this more carefully," I said, "but you're right. The similarities are notable." Caroline, I need to ask directly. Is there anything about this proposal that I should know before we sit down with Morrison Financial?" I looked at her for a long moment, thinking about Ethan's nervous pacing in the lobby, about Robert's confidence in his son's breakthrough innovations, about Linda's gentle dismissal of my career as something with computers. "Yes," I said finally, "there's quite a lot you should know." Marilyn leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to sharp attention. "I'm listening." "But first," I said, checking my watch, "I believe my family is waiting downstairs. Shall we begin the meeting? I think it would be more efficient to address these issues in front of everyone. A slow smile spread across Marilyn's face, the kind of expression that had probably terrified junior executives for decades. "Colonel Mercer," she said, "I think this is going to be a very interesting morning." The main conference room was a monument to corporate power, a long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries, with a wall of windows offering a commanding view of the city below. When the doors opened at exactly 9 o'clock, I watched Robert and Ethan enter with the careful confidence of men who believed they belonged in rooms like this. Robert's expression was all business, the kind of controlled intensity he'd perfected during 40 years of climbing corporate ladders. Ethan carried his presentation materials with the reverence of someone handling sacred texts, his face a mixture of excitement and barely controlled nerves. They were halfway to their seats when they saw me. The moment of recognition was almost comical, Robert's polished composure cracking like ice on a warm day, Ethan's confident stride faltering mid-step. I was seated at Marilyn's right hand, my uniform crisp and unmistakable, the silver eagles on my shoulders catching the morning light streaming through the windows. "Caroline." Ethan's voice came out higher than usual, uncertain. "Good morning," I said evenly, as if running into family members in high-security defense contractor boardrooms was the most natural thing in the world. Robert recovered first, his business instincts kicking in even as confusion clouded his features. "Caroline, are you here for the same meeting?" In a manner of speaking. Marilyn stepped forward, her voice carrying the kind of authority that immediately commanded attention. "Gentlemen, please take your seats. Colonel Mercer is here in her capacity as our senior strategic consultant for this evaluation." "Colonel Mercer." The words hung in the air like a revelation, and I watched my father and brother process information that fundamentally didn't fit with their understanding of who I was supposed to be. The meeting began with Marilyn's standard introduction to Aegis strategic systems, but I could see Robert and Ethan struggling to focus, their eyes darting between me and the presentation materials spread before them. Other executives filled the remaining chairs: Vice President of Acquisitions David Walsh, Chief Technical Officer Sarah Martinez, Director of Strategic Planning Michael Torres. All of them people I'd worked with for years, all of them treating my presence as completely normal. When it came time for Ethan's presentation, he stood with visible effort, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something closer to bewilderment. "Thank you for this opportunity," he began, his voice steadying as he fell into familiar rhythms. "Morrison Financial is excited to propose a revolutionary advancement in cybersecurity infrastructure that we believe will transform how defense contractors approach data protection." He clicked to his first slide, and there it was. The algorithm I'd developed during my master's thesis at MIT, dressed up in Morrison Financial branding and presented as groundbreaking innovation. I'd spent 18 months on that particular piece of code, working through mathematical proofs that had given me headaches for weeks. "Our proprietary defense shield system," Ethan continued, "utilizes multi-layered authentication protocols that adapt in real time to emerging threats." I let him continue for another few slides, watching him describe work I'd done during late nights in my apartment, fueled by coffee and determination. He was good at this part, the presentation, the sales pitch. He'd always been better with people than with code. When he reached the technical specifications, I finally spoke. "Mr. Mercer," I said, my voice cutting through his presentation with surgical precision, "could you walk us through the mathematical foundation of your encryption algorithm?" Ethan paused, clicking back to the relevant slide. "Certainly. The core principle relies on asymmetric key generation using prime factorization complexities that—" "Specifically," I interrupted, "could you explain how you solved the computational efficiency problem inherent in the verification sequence?" The silence that followed was telling. Ethan's face went through several expressions: confusion, recognition of danger, and something approaching panic. The verification sequence utilizes standard protocols adapted for our specific application," he said finally. "Standard protocols." I opened the folder I'd brought with me, extracting a document I'd prepared the night before. "Ms. Cole, if I may." Marilyn nodded, and I stood, moving to the presentation screen where Ethan's slides still glowed with familiar equations and diagrams. "The algorithm being presented here," I said, "was developed between January 2019 and June 2020 as part of a classified research project for the Department of Defense." I handed copies of my documentation to each person around the table. "Patent application filed June 15, 2020 under Security Classification Protocols. Primary researcher Colonel Caroline Mercer." The papers I distributed included everything: patent documentation, security clearance authorizations, project timelines, and mathematical proofs that clearly established the development chronology. Most damning of all was the original code repository, complete with timestamps and version history that predated Morrison Financial's supposed innovation by 3 years. "This is—" Robert started, then stopped, staring at the documents as if they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. "Impossible," I suggested. "Mr. Mercer, you're looking at classified intellectual property that was developed under federal contract and is currently protected under national security protocols." Ethan's face had gone pale. "Caroline, there must be some mistake. This technology was developed through Morrison Financial's internal research division." "Really?" I moved to my briefcase, extracting another set of documents. "Because according to these financial records, Morrison Financial paid me $75,000 in consulting fees between March and August of 2020. The contract specifically states that I was providing technical expertise and algorithmic development for proprietary security applications. The consulting contract was real. I'd kept meticulous records of every interaction with Ethan's company, partly out of professional habit and partly because something had always felt off about the arrangement. What I'd presented as friendly help to my brother had been carefully documented as legitimate business transactions. "So, the interesting thing about intellectual property law," I continued, "is that work-for-hire clauses don't typically apply to pre-existing patents, especially those developed under federal contract. So while Morrison Financial may have paid for consulting services, they never actually acquired ownership of the underlying technology." David Walsh, Aegis's VP of Acquisitions, cleared his throat. "Colonel Mercer, are you saying that Morrison Financial is attempting to license technology they don't legally own?" "I'm saying that Morrison Financial is presenting classified Defense Department technology as their proprietary innovation, which raises questions about both intellectual property theft and potential violations of federal security protocols." The room had gone completely silent except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 23 floors below. Robert was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not disappointment or dismissal, but something closer to shock. Ethan had sunk back into his chair, his presentation materials scattered in front of him like the remnants of a demolished building. "There are," I said, returning to my seat with the calm efficiency of someone who'd just completed a routine briefing, "several other technical innovations in this presentation that appear to have similar provenance issues. Would you like me to continue, or shall we address the legal implications of what we've already discovered?" Marilyn Cole was looking at Ethan and Robert with the kind of expression that had probably ended careers and dissolved contracts worth millions of dollars. "I think," she said quietly, "we need to have a very different conversation than the one we'd planned." The silence that followed was the kind that preceded earthquakes, a suspended moment before everything familiar cracked apart. I could see Ethan calculating desperately, trying to find an explanation that might salvage the situation, while Robert's face cycled through expressions of confusion, anger, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "Perhaps," I said, reaching for the final folder in my briefcase, "we should discuss the broader financial irregularities that have come to light during my review of this proposal." Marilyn leaned forward slightly, her attention sharpening. In the defense contracting world, financial irregularities were often more damaging than technical disputes. "Colonel Mercer, last month, I received an interesting phone call from my mother." I opened the folder, revealing bank statements and wire transfer records I'd spent weeks obtaining through proper legal channels. She was concerned about some family finances and wanted to discuss a gift she'd given me several years ago. The color drained from Robert's face. According to these records, I continued, distributing copies around the table. On March 15, 2021, Linda Mercer transferred $15,000 to my personal account. She described it as a birthday gift, though my birthday is in September. She was quite insistent that I not mention it to anyone, particularly not to Ethan or Robert. I could hear Ethan's breathing change, becoming shallow and quick. What makes this transaction interesting?" I said. "Is that the money came from an account linked to Morrison Financial's operating budget, specifically from a discretionary fund that Ethan manages for consultant relations and strategic partnerships." David Walsh was taking notes now, his expression grim. Financial impropriety in defense contracting wasn't just a civil matter. It could trigger federal investigations that destroyed companies and ended careers. The transfer was coded as family assistance, I continued, but when traced back through Morrison Financial's accounting system, it appears to have been drawn from funds allocated for technology licensing and intellectual property acquisition. Robert found his voice, though it came out strained. "Caroline, surely this is just a misunderstanding. Your mother wanted to help, and if there was some confusion about which account—" "Dad!" The word cut through his explanation like a blade. "The money was a payment. Specifically, it was meant to ensure my silence about the origins of technology that Morrison Financial was preparing to license to major clients." I pulled out another document, a recorded conversation transcript that had taken Linda 3 phone calls to finally explain clearly. Mom was very apologetic about the confusion," I said. "She thought she was helping to smooth over some business complications between her children. She didn't realize she was participating in what federal prosecutors would classify as attempted witness tampering in a case involving classified intellectual property." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Ethan's hands were gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "That's not—" he started, then stopped. Not what I asked quietly. Not what you intended, because according to the paper trail, Morrison Financial has made similar payments to 3 other former consultants over the past 2 years, always through family members or personal relationships, always coded as gifts or assistance, always accompanied by informal requests for discretion about past work relationships. Sarah Martinez, Aegis's chief technical officer, spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "Colonel Mercer, are you saying that Morrison Financial has engaged in a pattern of financial coercion to suppress intellectual property claims?" "I'm saying that Morrison Financial appears to have developed a systematic approach to acquiring technology through consulting relationships, then using financial leverage to discourage legal challenges to their ownership claims." I handed Marilyn the final document in my folder, a comprehensive report I'd compiled over the past month, cross-referencing Morrison Financial's patent applications with prior art from government contracts and academic research. 6 of their 8 major technology patents show clear derivation from work originally developed under federal contract or academic grants. In each case, the original researchers were later hired as consultants, paid through irregular channels, and subsequently remained silent about ownership disputes. The implications were staggering. If even half of Morrison Financial's intellectual property portfolio was built on misappropriated technology, they weren't just facing civil litigation, they were looking at federal criminal charges. Michael Torres, the director of strategic planning, cleared his throat. "Ms. Cole, given the nature of these allegations, I believe we need to involve our legal department immediately." Marilyn nodded slowly. "David, please contact our general counsel. We'll need to formally report these findings to the appropriate federal agencies." "Wait," Ethan said suddenly, his voice cracking slightly. "Please, let's not—" "Caroline, surely we can work this out between family. There's been some confusion, some miscommunication, but nothing that can't be resolved." I looked at him across the table, my brother, who'd built his entire career on work he'd stolen from me and others, who'd allowed our parents to see me as a failure while he accepted credit for my achievements. "Ethan," I said gently, 3 months ago, you presented technology I developed to the Department of Homeland Security as your company's latest innovation. You signed federal contracts worth $12 million based on algorithms I wrote during classified research projects. His face went completely gray. "That's not a miscommunication," I continued. "That's federal fraud, and it's not something I can work out between family." Robert was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not disappointment or dismissal, but something approaching awe mixed with terror. "Caroline," he said quietly, "how long have you known that my own family was systematically stealing my work and using it to build a business empire while treating me like a failure?" I considered the question seriously. I suspected for years. I had proof for months, but I decided to do something about it yesterday, after you called me a freeloader at dinner. The word freeloader seemed to echo in the conference room, gaining weight and significance as it bounced off the mahogany walls and floor-to-ceiling windows. "Yesterday evening," I said, "you toasted Ethan's success while dismissing mine. You celebrated achievements that were literally built on my work while suggesting I was somehow deficient for not living up to family standards." I stood up, gathering my documents with the same methodical precision I'd used to present them. "Today, you're learning that the daughter you thought was a disappointment is the person who's been making your son's career possible, and unfortunately for all of us, she's also the person who's going to ensure that justice is served." Marilyn Cole was watching the exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing a master class in strategic warfare. "Gentlemen," she said finally, "I think this meeting is concluded. Our legal team will be in touch regarding the next steps in what I believe will be a very complex investigation." As I walked toward the door, Ethan's voice followed me, desperate and broken. "Caroline, please, don't do this. Think about the family." I paused at the threshold, looking back at him one last time. I did think about the family, Ethan, for 36 years. Now I'm thinking about something else. "Before you leave," Marilyn said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. "There's one more matter we need to address." I paused in the doorway, noting how Robert and Ethan both looked up with something that might have been hope, as if there could be some last-minute reprieve from the catastrophe that had just engulfed their world. "Patricia," Marilyn called to her assistant, who appeared almost instantly with the efficiency of someone who'd been anticipating this moment. "Please bring in the display materials we prepared." What happened next was clearly choreographed, executed with the kind of precision that spoke to careful planning. 2 facilities staff members wheeled in a large easel draped with navy blue cloth, positioning it at the front of the conference room where everyone could see it clearly. "Aegis Strategic Systems," Marilyn announced, "has a tradition of honoring individuals whose contributions to national defense represent the highest standards of innovation and service." She moved to the covered display, her hand resting on the cloth. "These recognitions are not given lightly. They require extensive review by federal oversight committees, security clearance verifications, and approval from the Department of Defense itself." Robert and Ethan sat frozen, watching this unfold with the helpless fascination of people witnessing their own destruction. This morning's revelations," Marilyn continued, "have made it clear that some achievements have not received proper recognition. Some contributions have been systematically obscured or misattributed." She pulled away the cloth with a single, decisive motion. The display revealed a large framed certificate mounted on elegant matting, with official seals and signatures that carried the weight of federal authority. But what dominated the presentation was a large photograph, a formal military portrait of me in dress uniform, taken during a Pentagon ceremony I'd never mentioned to my family. "The National Partnership Innovation Award," Marilyn read aloud, "presented to Colonel Caroline Mercer for exceptional contributions to cybersecurity infrastructure development, resulting in enhanced protection protocols for critical defense applications nationwide." The photograph showed me standing beside a 4-star general whose name would be recognized by anyone who followed defense policy. My dress uniform was immaculate, my service ribbons more extensive than most career officers achieved in 20 years, my expression one of quiet professional pride. This award, Marilyn continued, recognizes Colonel Mercer's development of the Defense Shield security architecture, the multi-layered authentication protocols now used by 17 federal agencies, and the adaptive threat response systems that have prevented approximately 400 documented cyber attacks against critical infrastructure. I could hear Ethan's breathing change, becoming rapid and shallow. The citation notes that Colonel Mercer's innovations have been valued by federal oversight agencies at approximately $200 million in prevented damages and enhanced security capabilities. $200 million. The number seemed to echo in the conference room, gaining weight with each repetition. Additionally, Marilyn said, lifting a second document, Colonel Mercer has been selected to lead the Pentagon's next-generation cybersecurity initiative, a position that requires the highest level of security clearance and involves coordinating with our most sensitive national defense programs. She turned to face Robert and Ethan directly, her expression carrying the kind of authority that ended arguments before they could begin. Well, what this means, gentlemen, is that the woman you've been treating as an underachiever is actually one of the most highly regarded cybersecurity experts in the United States military. Her work protects systems that, if compromised, could threaten national security at the highest levels. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause in recognition of what had just been revealed. The technology Morrison Financial attempted to license to us this morning, Marilyn continued, represents approximately 18 months of Colonel Mercer's classified research, developed under federal contract and protected by security protocols that carry criminal penalties for unauthorized disclosure. She moved closer to the table, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a verdict. What you presented as your company's breakthrough innovation is actually stolen classified intellectual property. What you thought was your son's genius is actually your daughter's internationally recognized expertise. What you assumed was family generosity was actually attempted suppression of federal evidence. Robert was staring at my photograph with an expression I'd never seen before, not disappointment or dismissal, but something approaching reverence mixed with terror. The irony, Marilyn said, is that if you had simply asked Colonel Mercer about her work, if you had shown any interest in her actual achievements rather than dismissing them, you might have learned that she was already in a position to help Morrison Financial legitimately. Her consulting services are sought after by major defense contractors worldwide. She gestured toward the display, where my military portrait seemed to command the room. Instead, you chose to steal her work, diminish her contributions, and treat her as a disappointment while building a business empire on her innovations. Ethan finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Caroline, I didn't know. I swear I didn't understand what you really did. No, I said quietly. You didn't. You never asked. The Pentagon ceremony shown in this photograph, Marilyn continued, took place 8 months ago. Colonel Mercer was honored by the Secretary of Defense for contributions to national security that cannot be fully disclosed due to classification levels. She paused, letting that information settle. Wow, while you were celebrating your son's promotion to vice president of a mid-sized financial services company, your daughter was being recognized at the highest levels of government for innovations that protect our national security infrastructure. The weight of revelation seemed to press down on the room like a physical force. Robert was looking at me as if seeing a stranger, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't quite identify. The display will remain here, Marilyn announced, as a reminder to our staff and visitors of the kind of expertise and integrity we value at Aegis Strategic Systems. She turned to face Robert and Ethan one final time. Gentlemen, you've spent years dismissing and diminishing someone whose actual achievements dwarf anything your company has ever accomplished. You've treated as a failure someone whose success is measured in lives saved and threats prevented rather than profit margins and quarterly reports. The ceremony concluded with the same crisp efficiency with which it had begun, but the impact lingered. hanging in the air like smoke from an explosion that had just destroyed everything Robert and Ethan thought they knew about their family, their business, and their own importance in the larger scheme of things. As I prepared to leave, I looked one last time at my military portrait, remembering the day it was taken and thinking about how much my family didn't know about the person they'd been so eager to erase from their story. Tomorrow, that photograph would remind everyone who entered this building that some people are much more than they appear to be, and much more dangerous to underestimate. The elevator ride down felt longer than the ascent, gravity pulling us through 23 floors of silence that seemed to stretch into eternity. Robert stood rigidly in one corner, staring at the floor numbers as they descended, while Ethan leaned against the back wall with the hollow-eyed expression of someone whose entire worldview had just collapsed. I stood between them, no longer the dismissed daughter in a simple black dress, but Colonel Caroline Mercer in full military uniform, my service ribbons catching the elevator's fluorescent light like small declarations of war won and battles fought in places they'd never bothered to ask about. When the doors opened to the marble lobby, the morning light streaming through those floor-to-ceiling windows seemed different somehow, sharper, more revealing. The security guard at the reception desk straightened automatically as I passed, offering the same respectful nod he'd given when I arrived. "Colonel Mercer," he said with military precision. "Have a good day, ma'am." "Thank you, Sergeant Martinez. You as well?" Robert and Ethan followed behind me like mourners at a funeral, which, in a way, they were. Morrison Financial, as they'd known it, was dead. Their understanding of family hierarchy was dead. Their comfortable assumption that success was measured in corner offices and quarterly reports was dead. Outside, the October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the city moved around us with the relentless energy of people who had places to be and important things to accomplish. I paused on the sidewalk, breathing in the freedom that came with finally being seen for who I actually was rather than who they'd decided I should be. "Caroline," Ethan's voice behind me was small, uncertain. "Please, we need to talk." I turned to face them both. These two men who'd shaped my understanding of worth and failure for 36 years, who'd made me believe that their approval was something I needed to earn rather than something I deserved simply by existing. "What would you like to talk about?" I asked. Robert stepped forward, his business instincts still functioning despite everything that had just happened. "There has to be something we can work out. Some way to resolve this that doesn't destroy everything Ethan has built." Everything Ethan has built, even now, faced with irrefutable evidence that his son's empire was constructed on stolen foundation stones. Robert couldn't quite bring himself to acknowledge what that really meant. "Dad," I said gently, "Ethan didn't build anything. He assembled it from pieces that belonged to other people. There's a difference." "But surely," Ethan said desperately, "there's some way we can make this right. Pay licensing fees. Give proper credit, something that doesn't involve federal prosecutors and criminal charges." I studied his face, noting the panic beneath his attempt at negotiation. For the first time in our adult lives, he was asking me for something instead of taking it. "Ethan," I said, "last night you sat at that dinner table and watched Dad call me a freeloader. You listened to Mom dismiss my career as something with computers. You participated in erasing me from your slideshow presentation, editing me out of photos like I was some embarrassing mistake that needed to be corrected." He had the grace to look ashamed, but shame wasn't going to undo 20 years of systematic theft and dismissal. "You had dozens of opportunities to tell the truth," I continued, "hundreds of chances to give credit where it was due, to acknowledge that your success was built on collaboration rather than individual genius. Instead, you chose to let me be the family disappointment while you collected awards for my work." "I never meant," he started. "You never meant to get caught," I interrupted. "There's a difference." Robert was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that might have been respect mixed with fear. "Caroline, I need to ask, why now? Why reveal all this today?" It was a fair question, and it deserved an honest answer. Because yesterday, for the first time in my adult life, I realized that I was never going to be enough for this family. No matter what I achieved, no matter how successful I became, you would always see me as somehow lesser than Ethan, as someone whose accomplishments were cute hobbies rather than real achievements. I gestured toward the Aegis building behind us, where my photograph now hung in a place of honor. I spent 20 years trying to earn your respect by being perfect. Top of my class at the Air Force Academy, master's degree from MIT, classified security clearance, recognition from the Pentagon itself. None of it mattered because you'd already decided who I was supposed to be. The truth of it settled around us like dust after an explosion. So I stopped trying to be the daughter you wanted and started being the officer I actually am. And officers don't negotiate with people who commit federal crimes, even when those people are family. Ethan was crying now, tears streaming down his face with the helpless desperation of someone who'd finally understood the magnitude of what he'd lost. "Caroline, please, don't let this destroy our family." I looked at him for a long moment, remembering the brother who'd once built blanket forts with me, who'd taught me to ride a bicycle, who'd promised to always protect me from anything that tried to hurt me. "Ethan," I said softly, "you destroyed our family years ago. I'm just the first person to call you on it." I turned to walk away, but Robert's voice stopped me. "What happens now?" I faced him one last time. This man who'd raised me to believe that love was something you earned through achievement, that family was a hierarchy rather than a support system. "Now you learn to live with the consequences of treating your daughter like she didn't matter," I said. "Federal investigators will contact you within 48 hours. Morrison Financial's assets will probably be frozen pending investigation. Ethan will likely face criminal charges for fraud and intellectual property theft." The weight of it seemed to settle on them like a physical burden. "And me," I continued. "I go back to my job protecting national security, working with people who value competence over family politics and measure success in lives saved rather than profit margins." I started to walk away again, then paused. "Oh, and Dad, next time you want to toast someone's success, you might want to make sure you understand where that success actually came from." As I walked toward my car, I could hear Ethan calling my name, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone who'd finally realized that some mistakes couldn't be undone with charm and negotiation. But I didn't look back. Some bridges, once burned, were meant to stay that way. 3 months later, when Morrison Financial was formally dissolved and Ethan was sentenced to federal prison for intellectual property fraud, I was briefing senators on cybersecurity threats and designing protection systems for infrastructure they couldn't even imagine. My family's opinion of my career had become as irrelevant as their understanding of what I actually did for a living. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic confrontation. It's simply refusing to accept someone else's definition of your worth. And sometimes, the most devastating thing you can do to people who've dismissed you is to let them discover exactly how wrong they were. Thank you for listening to this story of discovery, justice, and family reckonings. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story today? Please leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts and where you're tuning in from. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one, and let me know what resonated with you most about Caroline's journey from dismissed daughter to vindicated officer.